there's still a lot to do. And from the point of view of writing a grant proposal, that's good news, because it means you can say that there are further achievements to be made. Whereas if cancer had been cured, you'd never get any money for research. Sorry if that's a bit flippant, but I'm trying to move over now to how this fits in with the prospective grant proposal. It's likely that sometime soon, the proposal will no longer be tentative, it will be actually there, and we get about 60 days to write a proposal and bid. So we've got to start preparing for that now, or fairly quickly. The good news is that the grant proposal wants research to be done. And we've already done some research in this very hour, because we've had a conversation between experts. That counts as research. Talking to experts is research, isn't it? So I'm going to throw in a couple of things that I came across today. This is on the blind programmers list. Somebody called Nina says, "Can you help me? I want to read this LaTeX on a Coursera course. I think it's part of a Jupyter notebook." So that's a real problem they've had, and various solutions have been suggested. Whether or not we can solve these problems, I think we ought to at least record some of these problems for the grant proposal to say, these are things we're aware of, and we'll try to deal with them as we go along if we can. Another one, which is really interesting, was there's a templating language, which is a sort of pipeline called Hugo. I use it for my website. And one of the components was not coming out accessible. And Rodney wanted to know how to make it accessible. So that's an example of a different pipeline, the Hugo pipeline for web pages, and it's got an accessibility fault and they want to solve it. I'll also mention that Pretext, which I think many of us know about, XML to multiple outputs, it has its own pipeline. So there's a lot of prior art from pipelines, including Pretext and Hugo. And at the same time, there's a need for small, simple pipelines for small, simple problems. So I think the whole area is quite broad, and judgment will be very important in terms of creating a good proposal. And I sort of think that a small working example and good studies of existing examples would take us a long way forward. So I think it's really important to not ignore, to take full account of prior art. And based on the comments earlier today, I would say it's really important to make part of the proposal disseminating the things that already exist. So the transformation of Wikipedia is something that should be widely disseminated, in the sense that anybody that is running a website that's got math content to significant degrees should know about that example and take benefit from it. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like to use MathJax but don't quite know how to. We might say, oh, that's for the MathJax people to do it. It's a solved problem. But if it's not being solved in the field, then it's an unsolved problem. And my understanding of the grant proposal is that that sort of thing is actually within scope. So my particular view is that a pipeline or pipelines are really important part of a grant proposal, and improving pipelines and developing new ones, developing new components are part of that proposal. But we want to avoid the problem of Maslow's law of the instrument, I think it's called, which is if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything you see is a nail. And if the only tool you've got is software, you think, well, we'll solve this problem writing software. Perhaps the solution is to train people to be sighted assistants, or perhaps train people not to do it anymore. There's so many different solutions. And I think we have to have a broadness of vision combined with the focus on results. I'll stop there because Steve has just happily put his hand up.
Thank you. I thought I'd make a couple of clarifications that I think are very important when it comes to writing a proposal. And I've covered this with Jonathan initially, but we could all get together, come up with a great idea, write a proposal, and it'll be thrown out the window. You have to consider the way the process of peer reviewing, of selecting winning proposals works. And one needs to fit whatever they think of into that framework, or it is going to be a waste of time. The way that we have done things in the past, and this is really the only way we have done them, is first to find somebody at a university, a PhD, of course, a person who is very, very interested in getting involved to the point of becoming a PI. The proposals that are submitted by companies and individuals, even individuals with PhD, not associated with a usually well-known university, will not normally get a lot of attention. I say this from having been a peer reviewer on a lot of technical proposals. So the first step is seeing whether or not there is a person out there willing to go to their university's foundation, or whoever it is handles writing proposals, then negotiating with them for overhead. You can't include 80% overhead on a proposal. Needs to be closer to 20. Some universities will laugh at that. Then the interest of the PI is of what is of prime importance. How do they view the problem? How would they solve it? And then you meet with the PI and you brainstorm and you help them understand what you might have to offer as a researcher or an individual. And then they are the ones that structure the proposal. It is then reviewed by everyone and then submitted. The way that we're discussing this now might inadvertently suggest, hey, we'll come up with some ideas, write them down and submit a proposal. And that just isn't the way these processes work when you're going for multi-year, $500,000, $1 million, $10 million grant opportunities. It's a very rigorous process, and the scoring is also very rigorous. It is also dependent upon who they select as peer reviewers. Peer reviewer may not agree with what the project is focused on and score it low. So there are a lot of complexities here that we're not really talking about. The good thing about what we're doing, we're vetting problems and thinking of potential solutions and potential topics to write a proposal on. And I think it's also important to understand there are two individual types of proposals. One is research, pure research. The other is development, pure development. If it's a development proposal, whatever it is you develop and whatever it is you claim the benefits are going to be, needs to be supported by scientific research. That has already been done. And the research needs to be rather recent. If the research is 4 years old, there are peer reviewers, including myself, that would say, gee, in 4 years, has nothing changed? Have you done any recent review of research? Aren't there any new methods? So what we're talking about is exciting. and we can put meat on the bones. But actually writing a proposal is a very intense, difficult, competitive thing, which fortunately we have been able to do successfully on many occasions. But it's not an easy process, and you don't always win. So I wanted to make sure that everybody factors all these things in to our conversations and realizes that that is what we will be facing if we decide that we've got something good and we want to move forward with a proposal. So that's enough said.
It's not nice being the bearer of the real world's to a group of enthusiastic people.
Yeah, that is the reality of the competitive market space for government grants. And it certainly is not impossible. This year, we've landed 3 grants, but we began by first finding the appropriate individual at a university who has enough interest in this to consider either becoming the PI or maybe a co-PI with a colleague. That is just how the US government operates. The agencies that we deal with, Health and Human Services, Department of Commerce, Department of Labor, Department of Education, and we've even worked with the White House. But it's an exacting process that hundreds of people compete for. I've seen 400 submissions to a 1-year proposal for $200,000. They narrow that down to 10, and they narrow it down by score, 1 to 100. And the top 10 then are presented back to the agency with the scores, and the agency makes the decision who to fund. So money, if you know how to go for it, it is not impossible, but it isn't as easy as coming up with great ideas and writing a proposal. And I'm sure all of you know this and understand it and have run into it before. But I felt it important to just bring all these things up to the surface. So I'm done speaking, and I'll turn it back to you, Jonathan. Fine.
Okay, I hope I'll just say one thing, which is getting a proposal at the end of this would be great. And if the proposal is accepted, that would be fantastic. But I want to get results all the way along so that instead of it being a bit like a bet where you put your stake in and you either lose your stake or you get a big prize, well, that's a lottery. I want us to put effort in, and for every piece of effort we get in, we make a benefit, whether or not the proposal comes out and whether or not the proposal is successful. And the big difference for where I am, I can't be a PI, I don't work in a university. I have been a PI for a small project, £30,000 a number of years ago. The the community involvement that we may be able to gather is, I think, the big benefit that goes along with the way in which I'd like to do things. So the blind math list and the visually impaired programmers list, for example, are full of real world experience of people having real world problems. And if we identify those problems, then that helps boost any proposal we do. And it helps any other proposal that wants to help disabled people, because it indicates these are some of the difficulties that are being overlooked and real problems that people have. I'll stop at that point. Maybe Jonathan G.
It's interesting you refer to the blind math list at this point, because relatively speaking, that list is extremely quiet compared to what it was like 10 years ago. The problems that we often see now on that list are people who just don't know where to look for the answer that exists, as against is there any way I can questions of 10, 15 years ago that didn't have a positive answer. And there haven't been the announcement of many new projects and people dreaming in recent times, because a number of the solutions have been developed, because they've been superseded by projects like MathJax, and because some of the solutions that we have today are almost taken for granted by the people coming up through high school and going on to university, because the tools have been put at their immediate disposal. You know, they're not encountering the problems because they're already built into the box in front of them. And I think the access to the mathematical content on web pages is a classic example for this. You know, we don't have the same problems getting to the equations in Word anymore. We don't have the same problems with accessing the equations in anything but the PDF coming out of tech in the same way that we did. So some of the problems that we are actually using as our starting point for reference in this conversation is because as a community, mathematicians generally have not moved on to the tools that are working better for the end users. Many of my colleagues are still using a tech-driven process that does not align itself well with the online teaching environments that we are expected to use today. You know, they have to produce a PDF, they have to put the PDF file as a downloadable object on a web page, because that's what they're restricted to using, because that's all they know how to use. They're not given a useful alternative right in front of them. And I actually think, Jonathan, you were right in saying a lot of this is about educating people. The blind community has been educated and had a lot of its problems taken away and hidden. We've still got a problem accessing everything that is old, the archived stuff that was not available in its source format. But I'm actually struggling to remember the last time I wanted access to something that was only available in a scanned image of a PDF and that had mathematics in it. The content that I need to deal with today, and that I imagine that the high school student or the undergraduate at university is dealing with, tends to be content that was created recently by their teachers, lecturers, tutors, because it has moved to being in an online environment. Is the content rendered properly? Is a question. And the answer is that it's not always rendered properly, but that comes down to the online teaching environment's ability to render that content. And even that ability has changed in the last 5 years quite dramatically. So I think one of the major problems is that the pipeline that people need is not at their immediate disposal. And then once you put the pipeline at everyone's immediate disposal, then you discover all of these problems around the fringes that haven't yet been fixed up. And the big one for me is still all of those graphics. Now I have to tell Kelly that everyone who's using Bookdown now, if they provide their source content and they've created statistical charts in there, for a lot of the modern ggplot created graphics, we can provide a computer rendered text version of what that is. So that's changing again, so that the blind person gets to reprocess the author's original work, and the blind person themselves will get the descriptions of the graphical content that they need in a very automated fashion. That's my really keen thing to happen, that the power or the control is taken away from the unconscious author and put in the hands of the end user who knows what they need and is given a very simple tool to be able to deal with it.
Okay, I think it's Steve Jacobs next. Thank you,
Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan, I have a question. I haven't heard of Bookdown, if that is the correct phrase that you're using.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about that? And I was also going to mention, pre-COVID, most universities in the US have an Office of Student Disability Services, and it is up to them to prepare alternate formats of textbooks for students with print disabilities. And unfortunately, the process really doesn't work well because the student needing a book might not get it for 3 weeks after the course starts. But with COVID, pardon me?
Or finishes.
Or finishes, yes. Post-COVID, a lot is going online, and the offices of student disability services are not doing as much to help students who should be self-advocating. And that is why it's so doggone important to focus on distance learning, digital documents, just like what Jonathan said